Good afternoon, everyone. This is Cassie Powers with the National Association of State Energy Officials, NASEO. We're delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar on corridor planning, models for electric vehicle infrastructure programs in rural and underserved areas. And so this webinar is part of NASEO's larger initiative with the U.S. Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office, as well as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to help support states as they begin their planning and implementation exercises in support of EV infrastructure investment under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We're delighted to be partnering with a number of organizations to help support the states, including the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissions, the Edison Electric Institute, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, and the American Public Power Association. And I'll also be pleased to be working with ICF and Atlas Public Policy in support of this series, and again, our larger initiative to help the states. I know it's a long list of partners, but I think it's important. Each of these organizations does a great job with helping to support the states as they work through various transportation, energy, and environmental program and policy implementation measures. And so with that, we are going to be exploring several of the models that states have used to support EV infrastructure investment. We've been joined by speakers from the states of Nevada and Florida. I am delighted to be joined by Candy Barley with the Nevada Department of Transportation and Jennifer Taylor with the Nevada Governor's Office of Energy, as well as Morgan Asbury with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Agency, the Office of Energy, and April Combs with the Florida Department of Transportation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our partners in the state of Nevada. And so Candy and Jennifer, we will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Cassie. And thank you so much for inviting Nevada to be part of this webinar today. My name is Jennifer Taylor. I am the Deputy Director for Intergovernmental Relations at Nevada's Office of Energy, and I oversee our programs on transportation electrification and electric vehicle infrastructure. And I will just take 1 second to let Candy introduce herself before we get moving through our presentation.
Hello, I'm Candy Barr-Worley. I am the Division Chief for NV2X at the Department of Transportation, and I serve as the innovation person for the Department of Transportation, and also serve as the recording authority for the designation of our alternative fuel highways through the state of Nevada.
Great, thanks. Next slide, Dylan. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about the work that Nevada has done in terms of electrifying our highway corridors. Nevada is, we like to think, a very state on a lot of fronts, not just in regard to some of the items you see on the sign here on 15 heading into Las Vegas from in the way back days. But we also think we're unique because we have been working on electrifying our corridors since 2015, and we've been working on innovative and great partnerships to help leverage those opportunities. Next slide. And just, we always have to say that part of the reason that we had an interest in transportation electrification, in addition to a lot of the other reasons that we'll talk about shortly, is our nexus to EV manufacturing through our Gigafactory up outside of Reno. One of the other unique things about Nevada, and you'll see this when Candy talks, is the fact that we're both the most urbanized state in the country with two major urban hubs anchoring the state, and then incredibly rural for the rest of the state. About 90% of our population lives in two cities or two regions. Next slide, please. One of the other reasons that Nevada has such an incredible interest in electrifying our corridors and making sure that there are transportation options for those who want to drive EVs and reduce their carbon emissions from their vehicles are the climate initiatives that the state has moved forward on, including joining the U.S. Climate Alliance, passing a greenhouse gas reduction bill, and having direction from our governor, Steve Sisolak, to work collaboratively with all state agencies in developing a climate strategy to help meet the goals under both the U.S. Climate Alliance targets, and our Senate Bill 254. Next slide. And you can see why that climate work is important, and those carbon emission reduction work is important, because transportation does represent our largest source of emissions in the state. Next slide. We also know that EV adoption is on the rise. While this number at the top, 7,000, doesn't look like a lot, you can see that there's been a lot of uptake in Nevada for the EV market. And really the number of registrations is probably closer to 12,000 at this point. We also are expecting a rise in EV market shares, as our Nevada Division of Environmental Protection has just in this fall passed clean cars standard regulations, which will we'll talk about that in a second, but it sets the frame for the market going forward. So next slide. And here's a little bit about the Clean Cars Standard. It will basically put a marker on the number of EV cars that need to be in inventory starting in 2024 for model year 2025. And our Division of Environmental Protection is now working on the second phase of that, which would be Clean Cars 2. Next slide. And so with all that background, we just wanted to give you a frame of why electrifying our corridors throughout our rural our communities is an important piece of Nevada's policy priorities. And so I'll pass it on to Candy for some discussion about what Nevada looks like.
So this map is a pretty star great state of Nevada, and the map shows the vast open
Andy?
land.
Andy, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're getting quite a bit of feedback on your line. Don't know if you want to check the speakers. And that is better already. So if you want to try again.
I didn't even do anything.
That works.
It sounds better.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay. Anyways, the map depicts our great state of Nevada, and it shows the open land and rural areas and also brings attention the two major hubs in our state, one in the south and one in the north. These hubs represent 90% of our population. So you can tell by the map versus the Las Vegas area and the Carson City, Reno area, there's a lot of space in between the two. We have 7 main arteries that run through our state, 3 interstates, 2 in the southern portion, and I-15 and the I-11, and 1 in the north, which is the I-80. The I-15 and the I-80 run east and west, and the I-11 runs north and south. The I-11 is in its infancy, with plans to grow throughout our state to reach from border to border is the ultimate goal that will help the travel between Canada and Mexico. Our third corridor that runs east and west is the US 50, and north and south we have 2 other corridors, the US 95 that runs on the western portion of our state, and the US 93 that runs on the eastern portion of our state. Our corridors serve as major freight movement from the ports of California to the states of the west of the Mississippi River. We also provide safe travel to all of our surrounding states to access our resorts and entertainment offerings. In 2019, we showed that over 42 million people visited our state. Jennifer? Next slide, sorry, Jennifer.
Thanks, Candy. So one of the vanguard programs the Office of Energy has worked on in terms of electrifying our transportation system, and we'll talk about all of the partnerships that have gone into it, is our Nevada Electric Highway. And the Electric Highway began as a partnership between GOE, NV Energy, which is Nevada's largest utility. It's an investor-owned utility that serves about 90% of the state. And Valley Electric Association, which is a co-op that serves the western parts of the state and is our second largest electricity provider. And it serves up along 95, and you saw the corridor map that Candy mentioned. So GOE, NV Energy, and Valley Electric wanted to expand Nevada's electric vehicle charging infrastructure along 95 between Las Vegas and Reno to connect those two corridors. And that was announced in 2015. And the idea was to look at where those cost-effective and strategic installations could go so that drivers could go from Las Vegas to Carson City and Reno in their electric vehicles. The 5 initial sites are listed here. You can see Fallon, Hawthorne, Tonopah, Beatty, and Indian Springs. One of the unique things about the site selections is that there was identification of opportunities to also serve our tribal communities, and the Fallon site is on the tribal lands in that area. Business and government entities along that corridor were encouraged to support EV infrastructure development by hosting charging sites. In 2018, and with the support of the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection and the VW settlement funds, the program was extended to include, as was mentioned, I-80, I-15, US 93, US 50, and then some additional charging locations along 95 to fill in those gaps for corridor designation. The phase 1 stations were required to include 2 level 2 chargers and 1 DC fast charger, and they were provided free for users for the first 5 years. Phase 2 stations similarly require those 2 types of chargers, the level 2 and the DC fast chargers, but host sites can make decisions about how to charge drivers. With that, to just give you an update, we've got 2 charging stations that are still in the build out phase, and we are hoping that those will be done the middle of this year. They are out on the eastern side of the state. Next slide. And I'll pass it back over to Candy.
Okay. We've been able to designate our main arteries as EV corridors through the FHWA process. And at this time, the I-15 is a completed corridor, meaning that from state line to state line, California to Arizona, we have completed the requirement of 50 miles in between stations. As of December 2021, we're working together with partnerships to complete, or we have completed 28 more charging stations, with 2 more pending that will be completed soon. The funding for the completed stations have been provided from the VW settlement. Next slide.
Okay, back to me. So this slide talks about, again, some of our utility partnerships. And I think that what's really key for Nevada in terms of having been able to do this build out is that there's a lot of, there's states that have funds that they can use to develop charging stations, provide incentives, do different programs. And Nevada does not necessarily have that type of opportunity. But what we do have are fantastic partnerships and a very close-knit state that knows everybody, and everybody is really supportive of the work and can work together. And we've got, again, like the places where we've looked to leverage those funds, like the VW funds. So when we went to extend the program and utilize those VW funds to expand charging on our other corridors outside of 95, we went to the rest of our rural co-ops as partners to say, help us find charging sites, we'll help fund these locations, and then you can also be part of the build out and part of the of this changed transportation economy. And one of our first partners was Lincoln County Power District. That is a really small county that sits on the eastern side of the state. The joke about Lincoln County is that there are more cows than people, but they have 2 GOE hosted electric charging stations, and they have the first community solar project in the state. So they're really innovative, and they are currently working on a grant to secure electric school buses. And one day I was talking to Senator Cortez Masto's state director, and he said that the senator was going up through Eastern Nevada, and did I have any suggestions for what she could visit in Lincoln County? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes, I have 2 charging stations she can visit. And I connected her with Lincoln County Power District. She was able to visit the Panaca location. And ever since then, the senator has been really excited about these opportunities in our rural communities. And so in Nevada, we're just really blessed to have the support of all of our electeds on this effort, from our federal level down to our local level. And then, as you know, we've got partners across the state in our rural power providers, even those that span, like Harney, across the border from Nevada to Oregon. Next slide. And then we talked a little bit already about partnerships with our state agencies. As I noted, with the governor's executive order, there was a direction for the state agencies to collaborate on a climate plan. And that was a great way to build on collaboration that had already been happening, again, through NDEP working with us to provide that VW funding that was targeted and designated for infrastructure build out. And we couldn't have done any of this work without them and their support. NDOT, who has not just worked in on the corridor designations, but also has been a site host for several of the sites. And then, as Candy will talk a little bit later, is part of and really leading the strategic planning effort for the IIJA funds that would come in. And then we've been lucky lately to have some additional partners with Nevada State Parks, as we'll talk about in a minute, and how they've been able to step in and help with corridor designations and infrastructure placement, as well as now being able to talk to our Department of Tourism with branding and engagement through some of the projects that Nevada's part of, like the Core West project. The other thing about the Nevada Office of Tourism is in 2019, they worked with, it's Tesla, but they worked to do an EV road trip, and they took Teslas down 95, charged at different locations, and highlighted the stations that were part of the Nevada Electric Highway. And so we're really lucky to be able to work with our state agencies on these different elements of visibility, of technical support, and of funding. So next slide. And I'm going to pass back to Candy.
Thank you. This slide shows our longest interstate route that travels from California into Utah. This is the I-80. With the open spaces and rural areas throughout our state, our longest corridor is the I-80 at 410 miles. The current status for building a completed designated corridor has developed some obstacles for our state. Currently, we have 7 gaps that do not meet the 50 miles in between charging station requirements set by the FHWA for the designated purposes. And while we do not meet the mileage requirement, we do meet the need of 60 miles or less. So we're so close to getting that as a designated road, but we've run into our challenges. Many of you may think that 10 miles is not that big of a deal, but 10 miles keeps us away from getting that designation. The issue that we have run into as far as I-80 is concerned is we have lack of power and lack of population in the areas where the stations are needed to be set. Next slide.
So back to me, and as Candy mentioned, we have had challenges looking at how to make sure that the 50-mile designation under FHWA can be met. One of the areas that we were having a challenge with was this area called Mill City Imlay, and there was not a host site available. And what we were able to do was reach out to state parks, GOE, NDOT, and then our partner NV Energy. Went to state parks and asked if they would be willing to support charging infrastructure at the Rye Patch State Park. What Nevada has a lot of, even if we don't have populations spread throughout the state, we have a lot of amazing outdoor places for recreation and tourism. And so having Rye Patch as a spot that we can start with as a pilot for showing where you can put charging that can support tourism and can support long dwell times was a really exciting opportunity. So up in the right-hand corner, you can see that the charging stations at Rye Patch are now complete. State Parks has been engaged in discussions with some private sector investors who are interested in helping to build out specifically state parks, not even national parks, but specifically state parks, to create again that network both for tourism and for travel. And a lot of times what's great about doing it at state parks is that you will find them off the corridors to help you meet those FHWA distances. Next slide.
Okay, on this slide, I'm going to be talking about US 50, which has been labeled the loneliest highway in the United States. Like the I-80, we have run into areas along US 50 where we have lack of population and lack of electricity. The gaps on US 50 consist of 6, with the largest being 76 miles. So like the I-80, where we don't have the partnership or the safety to place the charging stations, we are working hard to meet the Rev West minimum standards, because it's important for us to stay in alignment with our surrounding states. One way that we've been able to achieve this was to do a pilot program with a company and developed a solar station that is located in one of our smallest little towns that has a population of 17 people. And on the next slide, Jennifer is going to explain this.
All right, Dylan, if you want to cue up the next slide. As you can see here at Middlegate, population 17, it was 18. This is another small area 50 miles east of Fallon, where there is the Fallon Naval Air Station. So Fallon is a decent sized community, and that was one of our phase 1 sites. But Middlegate is this small little spot where there are some outdoor rec areas and this restaurant bar. And so, but they run on a diesel generator. So even though they were interested in hosting, there was no power for them to actually set up a site. So we were able to obtain a freestanding solar plus site that sits in the parking lot. And you can see the solar panels in the picture on the top left. And then you can see the charging station in the picture on the bottom right. The internal workings of the chargers are inside the shipping container. It is insulated so that computer equipment and monitoring equipment can be better cooled. There's a little cooling device inside the shipping container because it does get really hot, and you need to be mindful of systems that are exposed to those temperatures. And so this one is another one that we were really excited about, the idea of being able to innovate and create solutions where we had some obstacles to be able to create a network of stations across Highway 50. Next slide. So this is just a real quick overview to show you that there has been uptake on the charging stations as we've moved forward. You can see that there's incremental increases, and as more stations come on board, we expect to see this graph continue to spike and move up. Next slide. So Nevada has been, as I noted, working on this since 2015, and we've been really excited to be kind of on the leading edge in the Intermountain West in terms of developing our corridors and putting charging throughout our rural community. Part of that has been, again, about partnership and collaboration with our neighboring states in the Intermountain West, and we've been so grateful for their support and peer learning opportunities through groups like Rev West. In 2017, the governors of Intermountain West states signed an MOU to do specific work on EV charging. And I'll let Candy talk about that. But what I wanted to let everybody see for this map, just to really get a good visual, is that Nevada sits as a keystone state within the Intermountain West. The largest set of EV users is in California. And if they want to travel east, they have to pretty much come through Nevada. And folks in the Intermountain West that want to visit California or Arizona, they need to come through Nevada. So we see our role as very critical in making sure that those regional networks can be built out to provide that charging infrastructure for EV travelers. Next slide.
And I'm going to speak about our RevWest partnership and collaboration. In 2019, I began leading the efforts with NDOT as far as building our designated roads. I was encouraged from the Governor's Office of Energy to attend a RevWest meeting that was being hosted by RevWest and the FHWA in Utah. And after attending that meeting, it really brought focus on how important it is for the DOTs and the Governor's Office of Energy to be working hand in hand. It was at that meeting that I learned that many of the states worked with their DOTs, but didn't have great partnerships or didn't collaborate necessarily as much as they needed to. It was at the meeting that I was able to inform some of the energy departments. They were talking about signage and how they can do different things, and it came to my attention that you really can't do what you're wanting to do based off of the federal rules and regulations for signage. So it was important for the DOT to have some input so that they could help walk the energy departments through success stories instead of hitting roadblocks. I believe that it was that time that shortly after that, that Jennifer had joined the Governor's Office of Energy, and we have built great working relationship together and have been able to accomplish a lot during these last couple of years, even with COVID being present. Next slide, please. Then we have Core West, which is a group that has partnered within our RevWest territories, and it expanded our partnership to not only focus on just electric vehicles and electric charging stations along our corridors, but it also provided an opportunity for us to brand. It provided us an opportunity to reach out to our tourism departments and work more with them and identify other areas of needs throughout our state. And it also is allowing us to build our roads and highways to make them more accessible between the states. So we're cooperatively working together to be able to drive from state to state, much like the California, Oregon, and Washington has in the Pacific Coast. Next slide.
So I'll just give everybody a look ahead for what's next in Nevada for transportation electrification. And I know that this is about corridors, but if you can't get your vehicle to a corridor, then that's another issue. And so one of the policies that was passed in the 2021 legislative session was Senate Bill 448 that had two key transportation electrification components. One was an initial investment of $100 million into EV charging infrastructure. It was called the Economic Recovery Transportation Electrification Plan. And this is a plan that would put money towards the 5 different buckets that you see listed. But one of the important buckets is, again, the interstate corridor charging, with the recognition that it's important that Nevada continue and complete the work of having its corridors fully completed and designated as alternative fuel corridors. So we'll be working with NV Energy on sites, especially on Highway 80, that are needed to finish that corridor work. The other thing, and I'm gonna sort of do a little spoiler thing for Florida, but I'm really excited to hear about their work on emergency planning on with their EV charging, because that is one of the sort of pilots for the school bus piece, is for the school bus vehicle to grid pilot to include assessments on emergency planning through vehicle to grid access and vehicle to grid technologies. The second part of Senate Bill 448 requires the utility to regularly plan for transportation electrification through its IRP amendments. And the first one of those will be filed in September of 2022. And we're looking forward to see how that will continue to build out the state's transportation systems for electric vehicles at all of these levels of charging: interstate, urban, our transit systems, our school buses, and our public agencies. And just to again mention that one of the key pieces of what we've done in Nevada is really be able to leverage partnerships across agencies, state and local. And one of the other funding pieces of Senate Bill 448 was the public agency charging, where several of the agencies, NDOT, GOE, NDEP, the Department of Administration, were all tasked with working with the utility to make sure that there was a good strategic assessment of the planning for public agency charging. As I mentioned, Clean Cars 2 is being developed by NDEP. And then at the local level, as Candy mentioned, we've got two major major hubs for our urban areas. Clark County really is the urban hub for the state of Nevada. It's about 75% of the population. And so it is one of the driving centers for how we look at a lot of the state goals: greenhouse gas reduction, greenhouse gas emission reduction, TE development. And so they are currently working on a strategic transportation electrification plan themselves at the county level, and we are part of that, and we're excited to be included with their work. And then I'm going to just pass it to Candy real quickly to talk about the bipartisan infrastructure legislation.
Yes, we currently have out advertised an RFA. We are looking for help to plan, put our plan together for the bill, and we are looking to help our rural counties be able to apply for grants and have them be successful at reaching those grants and collecting the funds so that they are able to build out their infrastructure. And it will only add to our roads to make it more cohesive and easier to travel through our state. And back to you.
Next slide. And just really quickly to show you, this is some additional collaboration. GOE is also working with the utility on public agency charging outside of what I just talked to you about, Senate Bill 448, and supporting local government agencies. So we've got a shot from our Grant Sawyer State Building, the Clark County Building, and the City of Reno. And so while it's about corridors, we know that it's really about helping to find ways to build out across all of our states. So next slide. Thank you all very much for your time. There's a lot of stuff going on in Nevada. We're really excited about it. We're really excited about this picture. This shows our Governor, Steve Sisolak, in the middle charging up a vehicle at the Mesquite charging station, where we did the ribbon cutting and dedication of I-15 as a complete corridor. Candy and I are happy to talk to anybody and look forward to your questions and to our colleagues' presentation. Thank you.
Thank you to Jennifer and to Candy. It's wonderful to see the really exciting work coming out of Nevada. I know that the states in the West face some challenges with infrastructure placement, considering the great distances between towns and cities in that area. And so it's inspiring to see some of the examples. And so in the interest of time, we're going to hold on questions, although I have seen about 20 or so come in. And so we, just to let folks know that are on the webinar, we will be collecting the questions from the chat and the Q&A, so that we'll hopefully be able to address them following the presentations today, if we're not able to get to all of them at the end. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers from Florida, Morgan and April, who will be sharing a little bit about what's been happening at FADCS, as well as the Department of Transportation in support of EV infrastructure. Morgan.
Unmuting will help. No matter how far we go with this pandemic, I always forget. Hi, everybody. My name is Morgan Westbury. I'm a policy analyst with the Florida Office of Energy. I work on a variety of different transportation and energy equity issues within the state. And I'm very excited to be here with you all today to discuss some of the exciting projects that we have going on and how we are addressing some of these hurdles and that we all face with EVs and EV infrastructure. So before I jump in, I'll go ahead and pass it off to April to do her introduction.
Hi, my name is April Combs. I'm a statewide planner with the Florida Department of Transportation. I work in the policy planning office, and my areas cover EVs, emerging mobility, and broadband. So thanks, Morgan.
Thank you. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. And I want to start with this, that, a big theme that you'll see throughout my presentation, and something that I want to start with is the general planning process and the emphasis that we put on coordination here at the Florida Office of Energy, whether it's with our regional partners like NASEO, with the efforts such as Southeast Revy, our sister agencies like FDOT and FDEM, or our utilities and local organizations. We truly believe that coordination and stakeholder engagement are the key to our continued success in the EV planning world, especially within our state. We feel that any agency or organization that has anywhere from a whole hand to just a thumbprint into the transportation sphere needs to be involved in our open planning process. We need to break down silos wherever we can and really leverage successfully all the potential knowledge, participation, and funding in a way that is most beneficial to our citizens. And in doing this, we're also able to maximize our efforts while preventing overlap or duplication of efforts. And so to that end, I will jump in and break down some of the efforts that our office is doing to address EV infrastructure and energy equity as it relates to transportation. So on the next slide, I wanted to go ahead and give a representation of two of the different plans that we have and just some of the differences between them, and highlight again, we try not to duplicate any work, and be good stewards of both our taxes and our environment. And if you go to the next slide, I'll go ahead and start with the Florida EV roadmap. This was our first statewide comprehensive analysis of EV activities. It was published in 2020, and it's a great tool in our EV planning repertoire. The main objective was to identify the current status and the needs of EV technology and the needs of EV infrastructure in Florida, so that we can adapt to the changing landscape and thoughtfully plan the transition from traditional combustion fueled transportation activities to the projected EV growth that we are going to see in our state. We partnered with our Clean City coalitions to develop the EV roadmap. And over the course of this project, more than 500 stakeholders were involved in the planning process, whether that was attending workshops and webinars or submitting data and questions of what we should look at. The report itself contains a lot of great information to familiarize readers on the technologies that exist and the need for meeting the anticipated growth. An important thing to note, though, on this project is that it is intended to be a living document. With all of the wonderful R&D and the anticipated increases in technology at such a rapid rate, and it kind of being the first stab at the apple on a statewide analysis, we felt that the forecast produced in this report should be shorter than in some other planning efforts that are seen. So to help reduce uncertainty and capture this moving goalpost, the intention is to update it every couple of years as needed, so that we can keep pace with the needs of our citizens and millions of visitors that we see annually. That's why on the screen, you'll see one of our maps that was produced that has site recommendations for the first 3 years following the publication of this project, as well as existing and VW funded locations for DC fast chargers, along with a graph with the projections for EVs until 2030. And then if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about the Alternative Fuel Resiliency Plan. This plan, we partnered with DOE, NREL, and the Clean City Coalitions, and it will be published later this year. With Florida's unique geography, planning for hurricanes and hurricane events and the associated evacuations with them is not really an option, but a necessity. It's not an if we'll get hit by a storm, it's more of a when. So because of that, we determined that we need an analysis specific to resiliency so that we can build in some redundancies in our transportation fuels. And actually, a huge driver of this project and why we determined we needed it was Hurricane Irma, which hit Florida in 2017. This storm impacted 65 of our 67 counties and resulted in 6.7 million residents evacuating. This highlighted some of the shortcomings of our current infrastructure and the need to better plan for these events, particularly with EV owners whose evacuations were hindered by either a lack of or gaps in the EV charging infrastructure. So we need to break down the barrier, especially in rural communities and along these evacuation routes. As you see on the slide, with the proposed new stations that came from the model, the EVI Pro, through NREL, we jumped from about 86% coverage on evacuation routes to 98% with DC fast chargers, which is great progress. Another important analysis that is unique to Florida and other coastal states is the potential for storm surge and flooding events, both of which impact EV site selection. You'll see on the screen a map of potential storm surge within the state. This is modeled to a 100-year event. We also ran a model for the 500-year scenario, which didn't really end up being that useful because the amount of Florida that was not impacted was negligible. Again, just showing the true importance to plan and make sure that not only do we have the evacuation routes covered and are meeting our gaps, but also that those that are implemented aren't in standing water or impacted by storm surge or flooding. And then with this project, we are also really excited that there is a funding mechanism to implement the recommendations, whereas the EV roadmap was just a tool and in our planning process, this does have the funding mechanism to implement our recommendations, which is really exciting. The plan as a whole also covers all other alternative fuels such as CNG and propane. And like I mentioned, that will be published later this year. So I encourage you to check that out when it is published and let me know what you think. And then we'll go to the next slide. And I want to lastly kind of dive into the rural and equitable implementation. Our equity in Florida, sorry, lost my place. We have an upcoming energy equity study that would be published later this summer, and that really narrows in on these topics of rural and underserved communities. The study is going to give us a lot of important information regarding energy insecurity and the associated environmental and public health impacts that disproportionately affect these communities. It is of utmost importance here in Florida, like I mentioned, because of evacuations, to consider different economic and social disparities that cause barriers to EV adoption, specifically with EV infrastructure. As we move into the future, leaving behind underserved populations could literally mean life or death in evacuation events. With our other reports, they touch on equitable implementation, but we are proud to have started the development of this study for Florida, which as part of it will emphasize on transportation activities and identify some barriers to EVs that exist, such as insecurities around charging stations and lack of used EVs in the market. The study as a whole will provide a baseline and recommendations on how to best serve these rural and underserved communities in the transportation sphere. So, and just to exemplify that, I have a table that have all of our identified underserved communities with their current and projected need of DC fast chargers and public level 2, just to again exemplify where we're at versus where we need to be by 2030 and 2050 respectively, and why we are having such an emphasis on this issue. And then with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to April so she can talk about some of the plans she has going on.
Thanks, Morgan. So the Florida Department of Transportation, we produced the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Master Plan. Next slide. So this plan, it was statutorily required, and some of the things that were required by statute that we looked at were to identify all possible EV infrastructure locations, identify adoption barriers, which there are a lot. You would think by this time we've been talking about EVs for a while, the benefits, but there's still so many misconceptions out there. We also needed to look at the funding impacts to the state transportation fund and provide implementation recommendations and strategies. Next slide. So one of the things that we started looking at was where are all our available EV charging locations? And here's a map that includes everything in the state of Florida. You can see, like, we've got the Tesla on there. Those are the little yellow dots. It's a little hard to see the colors. The teal is the level 2. We've got a good amount of level 2 in the state. And then the publicly available we have on there. And then the green is what we got out of the VW settlement agreement. And so that's what we first looked at to see where we needed to go. Next slide. And so what we focused on and looking at our corridors and travel and connecting those, where we focused on the fast charging. And so this is what we have in the state of Florida currently for fast charging. And you'll see the difference between the green. The green is the VW settlement funds where those charging infrastructure went, and the orange is everything else. But this is all publicly available charging. And the point of this plan, and I've seen some questions pop up, does the state own this infrastructure? No, this is not any of our infrastructure, and this is not when we get to the point of saying these are our recommendations for infrastructure. It's very much not, this is where the charger has to be. We did a lot of work with our utilities, the investor-owned utilities, municipal and co-ops, got their input on the plan, as well as infrastructure providers. So when this went out, it's a very much like, this is an approximation of where we think things should go. But with this, it's with the caveat of, if you're looking to put in some infrastructure, you really need to be developing those relationships with your utility and infrastructure provider to be making good decisions. Because by moving, a proposed EV location like a mile or two, you could be saving yourself quite a bit of money. And so I think that's one of the good things that partnerships and conversations, they go a long way, because, it definitely affects the bottom dollar. So definitely keep, if I could say that, over and over again, is have open lines of communications, conversations, partnerships, stakeholder engagement really makes a difference in any kind of project planning that goes on. Next slide. So when we looked at the market adoption, and we ran a couple of different scenarios here, we did an aggressive, moderate, and conservative. It kind of when you can see from the graph is where it's going, that when it comes to kind of 2035, 2040 is where you're really seeing quite a bit of growth in the state. Right now, Florida's at 0.41% as far as registrations are concerned. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot as far as EV registrations are concerned, but that does put Florida as second in the nation for EV registrations. One of the things that came out of, the process of, stakeholder engagement is the need for data, and having more of this data as, where are we now with EV registrations? And if anyone from the New York Energy Office is on the call right now, I do want to give you a shout out. You've got a great dashboard on your website for EV registrations and breakdown by county, corridor. I think that's really great. And having that information and data goes a long way to planning and for planning and for the local levels to help them plan, and utilities. So that's one thing here in Florida that we've done as a result of some of these planning efforts, is to get data that EV registrations out of our sister agencies, to get them over here and start putting them in useful ways where our stakeholders can use them for planning efforts. Next slide. So what we have here, and this isn't going to be, if you're familiar with Florida, not going to be terribly surprised with our adoption by county. We have a lot of adoption in the southern part of the state, Orlando area, up in Jacksonville. But we also need to look at connecting those areas. We have a lot of people traveling between the coasts. So making sure that some of those corridors are connected, I think that's pretty important. Making sure when people come into the state that we have sufficient charging as well as leaving the state. One of the things we're also doing with data that I think is pretty interesting, because when you're looking at adoption and where, based on this map, where you would think your EV charging needs to go is, where the adoption rate is. But we have a lot of people coming into the state, a lot of visitors. So we have one of our departments here that are able to now look with cameras and identify what type of car it is, and if it's an EV, and if so, we're now counting that to see exactly how many EVs we have in the state, because it's not just Florida residents, it's the all the tourists that are coming into the state. And so that's something for Florida that we really need to keep an eye on and track, and make sure that we have sufficient chargers, not for just our residents, but our visitors as well. Next slide. So here is a list of and a map of our proposed locations for EV charging. And we did it on a priority scale, which, where we think it needs to go in first. And so that is the orange, and that's filling out our I-10 corridor. So mainly, people coming in, leaving the state and getting across that 10 corridor. But what we looked at to get to these proposed locations was the lack of existing EV infrastructure, traffic volume, proximity to intersection, and evacuation routes. So, once again, this isn't, for state infrastructure, what we're saying, but it will help definitely be used for the bipartisan infrastructure law funding. I think this can be a great resource and tool for us as we move forward, but also for infrastructure providers in the state, utilities, local governments. It's just a great resource for planning. And with this, we do have a story map on our website that allows you to get very granular into this and take a look. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to provide that. We also have a tech memo on step-by-step how we did our analysis and performed this gap analysis. So I'm also happy to provide that as well. Next slide. One of the things that we see and came across was education. And that's a huge part in moving forward with EV adoption. There's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there at all levels, really. And I think if you're on this webinar, you have a background, you have knowledge, and I think we all need to be sharing that knowledge. There's a lot of potential just to do a lot of good. There's an unprecedented amount of funds with for transportation related items with a bipartisan infrastructure law coming that we can just do a lot of good with, connect a lot of corridors, have a lot of reliable travel times, solve a lot of problems. And that's kind of working together, taking the misnomers out. And, kind of when you hear that or read that article that's, that clickbait that's, EVs are destroying our electric system, and we can say no, and that's why, because we do the planning, we put in the work, we work with our utility partners. So I think as much as, we can do to educate on every level, that's going to be, beneficial to all. Next, please. Morgan mentioned to you all Hurricane Irma, and those are some startling facts that she mentioned, and something that we shouldn't just just gloss over lightly. And let me go back to that. 6.7 million people had to evacuate. That is just staggering. 60% of our state was without power at the peak, and 300,000 electric customers were without power a week later. So, I mean, that's just what, a storm can do here in Florida. And that was 2017, so it wasn't that long ago. And when you're talking EVs, it's not just the issue of evacuating, it's getting back home as well. So that's something that we really think about as far as resiliency and emergency evacuation. And what are some of our options? What do we need to be doing? You can see there at the bottom right in the slide, having some of those, multiple chargers that can be moved. I mean, that would be great at a rest stop. On-site backup power, You know, we need to be thinking about that and resiliency and what we can do as a state, because as Morgan said, it's not like if a storm's going to hit, but when. Next slide, please. And our rural areas. Our rural areas are key in this. Not only do we need to be connecting them because it's the right thing to do, but I mean, these are major areas in our evacuation routes as well. So I think with the bipartisan infrastructure law, one of the things that is required for the EV funding is that the infrastructure be on alt fuel corridors. I think Florida's done a great job of building out our corridors, and we'll continue to work on that. But I think it's important to look at some other corridors too. Highway 2719 that runs along the West Coast is a major evacuation route for folks, and it would really behoove the state to have that as a corridor and a complete evacuation. So looking at secondary corridors, I think is a great thing for our state. We need to be planning not just the interstates, but those other highway systems as well. So I think there's a lot of planning and work that can still be done, especially in our rural and underserved areas. I think those are going to be key moving forward and helping complete this network of charging for our state. Next slide. And with that, I'd like to take a minute to remind everyone that whatever text you're sending is not that important. So just put it down, enjoy your drive, your surroundings, even if they're not that great. Be safe when you're out there. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Morgan and to April. Amazing ideas and examples coming from Florida. We are already out of time, and so we will have to take the many questions that we got through the chat as well as the Q&A and share them with our speakers. And audience members, thank you for your active participation throughout. And a big thank you to our 4 speakers for taking time out of their day to share a little bit about what's worked in their states. I wanted to make a couple of announcements before we close out. First, again, thank you everyone for signing in. We will be hosting 2 more webinars over the next 2 weeks to further explore these themes. Next week, we'll be hearing from state agencies in Oklahoma, in Michigan, and in Virginia to talk a little bit about their EV infrastructure planning and implementation models. And then on April 2nd, we'll be hearing from some additional states on their stakeholder engagement strategies. As you can tell, partnerships is a key theme that we are emphasizing throughout this series and our broader work, and we'll be working with our project partners to continue to support the states as they work through planning and implementation exercises in support of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. To that end also, we will be developing a website that we hope to launch in mid-February that will compile resources that states can use when designing and growing their EV infrastructure programs. This EV State Planning Clearinghouse is going to be again launched in Florida around the same time that the guidance from FHWA is released for the National EV Formula Program. NASEO, as well as our partners at AASHTO, will be issuing a request for information in the next day or so to state agencies to gather some important documents that states have been using during their EV infrastructure implementation planning and design process. This includes model RFPs, staffing and budgetary models, etc. And so just a note to our states to please keep an eye on your inbox, because we'd love to get those resources, other documents and tools that you all have been using during your EV planning process to add to our clearinghouse and share with other states. And so